In the autumn of 1887, in the foothills east of Laramie, Wyoming Territory, a young woman named Vera Crane walked into the Platte County Recorder's office with a single folded document and asked to examine the conveyance ledger for parcels along Elkhorn Creek. The clerk looked at her once, then looked past her at the line forming behind, and told her the ledger was in use. She said she would wait. He said it could be some time. She said she understood. She sat on the bench beside the door for 4 hours, her hands folded over the document in her lap, until the clerk finally set the ledger on the counter before her without a word. She spent 20 minutes with it, made 2 careful notations in the small book she carried, then thanked him and walked out into the cold afternoon light. What she was looking for wasn't in the ledger. That, too, was information. Vera Crane was 27 years old. She had come to Laramie in the spring of that year with $31, a change of clothes, a narrow leather satchel containing her surveying instruments, and a folded document that had arrived in the mail 3 weeks after her Uncle Clement's funeral in Missouri. The document was a deed. Its provenance was unusual, and the claim it described was one the Platte County Bank had spent 8 years treating as if it did not exist. Her Uncle Clement had taught her to survey. He had also taught her something about deeds. Clement Crane had been, in his working years, one of the more meticulous cadastral surveyors in western Missouri. He had spent 40 years walking landlines, setting iron pins, recording monuments, and appearing before courts and commissioners to testify about precisely where the earth began and ended on any given parcel. He had learned the trade from his own father, who had learned it from his, and he had passed it to Vera because she was the one in the family who would sit still long enough to learn it. Her father, Clement's younger brother, had died of fever when she was 11, and Clement had taken her in for the 4 summers after that, putting the transit in her hands and walking beside her across the Missouri bottomland while he explained what the instrument saw and what her eyes must verify. By the time she was 18, she could close a survey to within a link. By 22, she could read a deed description aloud and visualize the parcel on the ground before she had walked a step of it. She had gone to Clement's funeral in April of 1887 with the rest of the family and stood at the graveside in the April cold and felt the particular grief of losing the person who had made her what she was. The envelope had arrived 3 weeks later. She had not known he had sent it. She opened it at her kitchen table, alone, on a Tuesday morning. The deed inside was a copy, not the original, but it was attested by Clement's own hand, and beneath it was his note, written in the precise, unhurried penmanship she associated with his survey field books. She read the note twice, then read the deed, then read the note again. The parcel in question was a quarter section of tableland on the west bank of Elkhorn Creek, with a house, a root cellar, and 3 outbuildings. Clement Crane had purchased it in 1875 from a man named Arlo Petch, who had broken ground there in 1871 and farmed it for 4 years before his health gave out. Petch had sold the surface rights and the structures to Clement for $410 in coin, retaining by agreement a single underground easement. The rock-cut cellar beneath the house, which he had spent 2 summers carving from the limestone shelf, and which he used to store a portion of his winter provisions while he stayed through the cold months in town. The arrangement was noted in the deed, recorded in the county ledger, and witnessed by a justice of the peace named Harold Birch. Petch had died in the winter of 1878, a year after his wife, leaving no children. His estate, such as it was, had passed to a nephew in Kansas who had never visited the territory and who had eventually sold what he believed he owned to the Platte County Bank, which held a note against the property at the time of Petch's death. The bank, in turn, had sold the surface parcel to a man named Dolph Marsh, who farmed the land lived in the house, and used the cellar without obstruction for 9 years. When Clement Crane died in the spring of 1887, the bank's vice president, a man named Chester Vogt, sent a letter to Clement's nearest relative, informing her that the estate's claim to the Elkhorn Creek parcel had lapsed and that the bank was prepared to accept a nominal settlement of the matter at her convenience. The letter did not mention the deed. Vera had the deed because Clement had sent it to her 2 months before he died, with a note in his precise, unhurried hand. "Keep this where no one will look for it. The cellar was cut from the living rock. It belongs to the estate. Do not let them tell you otherwise. If you have ever held a piece of paper and understood, in your hands, that someone had tried to bury it before you could read it, then you understand what Vera felt that morning in Missouri, sitting at her kitchen table with the envelope open and her uncle's handwriting in front of her. She packed the same afternoon. She arrived in Laramie in April on the Union Pacific from Cheyenne, with everything she owned in 2 cases, the deed inside the smaller one between 2 shirts where nothing would crease it. The town was larger than she had expected, and the streets were muddy from spring runoff. She found a boarding house, located the recorder's office, and the next morning walked the length of the business district until she had a sense of where things were. Laramie was a rail town. It had grown quickly and without much plan along the line, and it carried the feel of a place that had surprised itself by becoming permanent. The older buildings were wood frame, weathered and serviceable. The newer ones were brick, which meant the town had arrived at the point where its people intended to stay. The Platte County Bank was among the brick buildings, 2 stories on a corner lot with large plate glass windows on the ground floor. It looked exactly as a bank is supposed to look, solid, legible, and quietly declaratory of the proposition that it held more than it gave away. She took a room at Polly Soon's boarding house on Glendale Street and paid 2 weeks in advance, which was all she could afford to pay at once. Polly asked no questions. She showed Vera the shed behind the house and said she was welcome to the use of it if she had work that needed doing. She charged $3 a month for the room with breakfast. Chester Vogt's office was on the 2nd floor of the bank building, behind a frosted glass door with his name painted in gold leaf. Vera had visited him twice in the weeks after her arrival. The first visit he had been polite and brief. He told her the bank held valid title to the surface parcel under a conveyance executed in 1878, that the estate's claim was without standing, and that the question of the cellar was a practical impossibility, since the cellar sat beneath the house and was integral to it under any reasonable reading of the law. She asked whether he had reviewed the 1875 deed. He said he was familiar with its contents. She asked whether he would confirm that the cellar easement was recorded in the county ledger. He said the recording was irregular and would not survive challenge. She thanked him and left. The second visit was shorter. He had anticipated her return. His tone was not impolite, but it had hardened by a degree, the way a man's tone hardens when he has spent time deciding something and does not wish to spend more time on it. He told her the bank's position was settled. He told her that pursuing the matter further would require legal proceedings she could not afford, and that the outcome would not favor her. She listened to all of it. Then she asked him one question, whether the bank's 1878 conveyance from the Petch estate had explicitly included the cellar. He said the conveyance covered the parcel in its entirety. She thanked him again and left. She did not visit him a third time. What she had understood, sitting on the bench in the recorder's office that long afternoon, was that the county ledger's entry for the 1875 Petch to Crane deed had been altered. Not clumsily, not obviously, but the entry showed no easement notation where the deed itself described one clearly. The ledger was the official record. The deed was a private instrument, Without the ledger's corroboration, the deed was only as good as the memory of Harold Birch, who had witnessed it and who was now 74 years old and living on his son's farm outside Cheyenne. She had also examined the physical ledger with the care Clement had taught her to bring to any document she suspected of being other than what it presented itself as. A ledger entry is not a single act of writing. It is several acts, separated in time, performed by different hands. The county recorder's ledger for 1875 showed, on close reading, a faint difference in the ink density of the Petch to Crane entry. The first portion of the entry, the parties, the date, the parcel description, was written in a slightly darker hand, a shade more brown with age. The portion that should have contained the easement notation was written in a fractionally blacker ink that had not aged quite the same way, as if applied some years after the original entry was made. The difference was subtle enough that a man looking for the recorded conveyance of a parcel would never notice it. It was not subtle enough for a woman who had spent her formative years learning to read documents with her hands as much as her eyes, running a fingertip along a line of text the way her uncle had taught her to run a fingernail along a property boundary on a hand-drawn plat. Someone had come back to the entry after the fact. Someone had returned with ink and a pen and erased, not by scraping, but by overwriting, the easement clause in the ledger copy, replacing it with a continuation of the parcel description that read as if the easement had never been agreed upon. It was careful work, but careful work leaves traces, and traces are what surveyors are trained to find. Vera had a surveying kit, a deed, a notebook, and $31. What she needed was the cellar itself. She found Dolph Marsh at his fence line on a gray Tuesday morning in October, mending a section of post and rail that the autumn rains had heaved. He was a large, quiet man, broad through the shoulders, who listened to her explain herself without interrupting. When she finished, he stood for a moment looking at the fence post in his hands. He said he had wondered sometimes about the cellar. She asked what he meant. He said that when he had taken possession of the property, he had found the cellar door locked with a mechanism he did not recognize, a precision lock of a kind he had never seen on a farm property. He had eventually pried the hasp free rather than trouble himself with it, but he had kept the door itself because it seemed the kind of thing a man did not throw away. He took her to the cellar. The entrance was built into the north slope of the house's foundation, a stone archway perhaps 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, fitted with a heavy oak door on iron hinges. The door Marsh had pried open 9 years ago leaned against the house's east wall, weathered gray, the lock still set in its mortise. Vera examined it without touching it for a long moment. It was a 5-lever Brahma tumbler lock. She had seen 2 in her life, both in St. Louis, both on commercial strongrooms. They were English mechanisms, precision machined, not available in any hardware catalog she knew of on the western frontier. They cost, in 1875, approximately $40 new. Arlo Petch had been a farmer of modest means who had died with a banknote against his land. He had not bought this lock. Someone else had. She asked Marsh whether she could take the door. He considered this, then said she was welcome to whatever was underground, since it had been more trouble than used to him. He helped her carry the door to the wagon she had hired and strapped it flat in the bed. She gave him $2, which he tried to return, and she insisted he keep it. Vera had taken a room at a boarding house on Glendale Street run by a widow named Polly Sund. She set the cellar door against the wall of the small shed behind the boarding house, where Polly allowed her to work in the evenings. She had a candle lantern, a magnifying glass, her tools, and the deed. She spent 3 evenings examining the lock. Polly soon brought her tea on the second evening and stood in the shed doorway, looking at the door laid flat on the workbench, The lamp angled low across the iron fittings and asked what she was looking for. Vera said she was looking for what the lock could tell her that the ledger would not. Polly considered this. She was a practical woman of 50 or so, wide-shouldered, with a habit of folding her arms and studying a thing before she spoke about it. She had asked no questions about the cellar door when Vera had arrived with it in a hired wagon, only helped her get it off the bed and into the shed. She said now that she had known Chester Fote for 15 years, and that he was a man who wrote everything down and kept it. She did not say anything further, but Vera understood what she meant. That a man who kept records kept them because records were his instrument of control, and that a man who used records that way had learned somewhere that records could be altered as well as kept. Polly said good night and left her to the work. A Brahma tumbler lock is a remarkable instrument. Its internal mechanism was designed on a principle of compounding precision, each lever of a different profile, each requiring alignment before the next would yield. The key is a hollow cylinder with internal cuts that must depress all 5 levers simultaneously to a single precise depth. The mechanism cannot be picked by feel. It can only be opened by its own key or destroyed. Clement had written in his survey notes years before that a lock is only as honest as the hand that set it. By this, he had meant that a lock tells you something about what the person who installed it believed was worth protecting. She did not need to open the lock. She needed to understand what it meant that it was there. On the 4th evening, she found it. Along the bottom rail of the door, where the wood had been sheltered from most of the weathering by the stone archway, a faint stamp remained in the grain, a serial number of 11 digits, and beneath it a foundry mark she recognized as that of a Birmingham manufacturer. She copied both into her notebook by candlelight, her penmanship precise and unhurried. The mark was not from an American foundry. It was English. Clement had once ordered a small English level from a firm in St. Louis that served as American agent for several British instrument makers, and she had seen similar stamps on hardware they carried. She wrote a letter that evening to that agent, a man named Perkins, asking for the purchase record associated with the serial number she had copied. She mailed it the next morning and waited. Patience, Clement had told her, is a surveying instrument. You cannot measure a line you are in too much of a hurry to set the rod for. She used the 10 days of waiting to examine the cellar itself with more care than she had given it on the first visit. Marsh raised no objection. He had concluded, she thought, that the legal question was not going to resolve itself by being left alone, and that having it resolved one way or another was better than having it unresolved indefinitely. He was that kind of man. He gave her the lantern from his own barn and told her to let him know if she needed anything moved. The cellar measured 14 feet from the archway to the back wall and 11 feet across, dimensions she confirmed with her chain. The walls were dressed limestone in uniform courses, the mortar lines tight and even. Whoever had cut and laid this stone had worked with care. There were tool marks on the east wall where he had used a mason's chisel to true the face, the same shallow diagonal hatching she had seen on good foundation work in St. Louis. The work was not rough. It was the work of a man who had decided that if he was going to spend 2 summers in the dark cutting stone, he was going to cut it right. She took dimensions, noted the drainage cut's slope and direction, sketched the shelf positions on the east wall, and measured the niche in the southwest corner 3 times before she moved the face stone. It was the 3rd time, measuring slowly with her fingertips along the mortar seam, that she felt what she had almost missed. A slight differential hardness between the mortar on the north and east seams of the niche and the mortar on the south and west seams. The north and east mortar had the brittleness of work more than 10 years old. The south and west seams were harder, less oxidized, consistent with the more recent work, perhaps 5 years old, perhaps 8. The niche had been opened and resealed within the past decade. Someone had known it was there. She drove the chisel into the south seam first, carefully, the way she had learned to drive a survey pin. Not hard, but deliberate, with a single clean motion that committed to the direction and did not waver. The mortar came away in a clean line. The east seam followed. The face stone shifted inward a fraction of an inch. Then, when she worked the blade into the gap and applied leverage with both hands, came free in one piece and sat solid in her palms. The niche was intact. The 3 objects inside had not moved. She took all 3 to Polly Soon's shed. The paper was a letter dated October of 1877, written in a labored hand, addressed to no one, and signed by Arlo Petch. It was not a legal instrument. It was an account. In it, Petch described the approach made to him in the summer of 1876 by an agent of the Platte County Bank, a man he named only as the agent, who had offered to purchase the underground easement from him for an amount he described as sufficient to settle his note. Petch had agreed. He had signed a document, received the payment, and been told that the transfer was recorded. He wrote that he had later asked to see the recording and been told it was filed with the deed. He wrote that he no longer believed this was true. He had visited the recorder's office himself in the autumn of 1877 and had found no such recording. He had gone to the bank and been told the recording was with the territorial office in Cheyenne, not in Laramie. He had not had the resources to travel to Cheyenne. He described himself as an old man without the strength left to fight a bank, and said that he was placing this letter in the niche he had built, along with what he had, so that the record would not rest entirely on their word alone. There was a line near the end of the letter that Vera read 3 times before she moved past it. Petch had written that he built this cellar to keep good things whole. I built the niche to keep this. I have no one else to give it to, so I am giving it to the stone. The tin dispatch box contained the signed receipt for the payment he had received, $22. The receipt was on bank stationery. It was signed with the initials C.V. Chester Vogt. The canvas sack contained the key to the Brahma lock. Vera sat with all 3 objects on the work table for a long time before she moved. The candle had burned down a full inch. The shed was cold, and she did not notice. Arlo Petch had understood that what had been done to him was deliberate. He had understood that he lacked the means to prove it or contest it. He had done what a careful man does when he cannot fight something directly. He had left evidence of it in the most permanent place available to him, sealed against the years, trusting that someone would eventually know how to look. He had not known who that person would be. He had not known when. He had sealed the niche and written to the stone, and the stone had kept it for 10 years. Clement had not found it, though she suspected now that he had known it was there, or had known enough to know it was worth knowing. That was why he had kept the deed. That was why he had sent it to her with his note. He had understood the shape of the wrong, even if he had not been able to open the niche himself. And he had passed what he had to the one person he trusted to take the next step. She felt the weight of that understanding settle in her chest, not painfully, but with the specific gravity of something that had been handed down to her and now required her to be equal to it. She was. She intended to be. What Petch had been told was that the bank had purchased his cellar easement from him in 1876. What the bank had actually done, as best she could reconstruct it, was purchase the easement privately and then allow the county ledger's recording of the original 1875 Crane deed to stand without the easement clause, while destroying or suppressing the transfer instrument. When Petch died and his estate's rights passed to the Kansas nephew, the bank had represented to that nephew that the estate's interest was only the note, not any real property claim. The nephew, knowing nothing of the territory, had agreed. The bank had then sold the parcel to Marsh without disclosing the seller's complicated ownership history. Clement Crane had known. That was why he had buried the deed with his niece instead of in a file drawer. He had known the ledger was wrong and had not been able to prove it while he lived. She spent the days waiting for replies from St. Louis and Cheyenne in the way she had learned to spend waiting, not passively, but occupied with adjacent work that would be useful no matter what the replies contained. She drafted a written account of the ledger discrepancy she had observed in the recorder's office, describing in plain terms the differential ink density, the apparent later addition to the original entry, and the methodology she had used to distinguish the two. She wrote it as she would write a survey report, without color or conclusion, naming only what she had observed and what standard documentary practice would make of it. The report was not itself evidence. It was preparation for the moment when she had to explain her reading of the ledger to someone who had not been there. She wrote a second document describing her examination of the cellar door, noting the lock, the serial number, the foundry mark, the precise location on the door rail, and the conditions under which she had found it. She wrote it the same way. She was not building an argument. She was building a record of observed facts, ordered so that the argument would be visible to anyone who read them in sequence. It was what Clement had taught her that surveyors do. You do not tell the court where the boundary is. You show the court the monuments and the measurements and the traverse, and you let the boundary become visible on its own. The letter from Perkins in St. Louis arrived 8 days after she had mailed hers. The Brahma lock bearing that serial number had been sold in March of 1876 to a buyer in Laramie, Wyoming territory. The buyer's name was recorded in the invoice. It was Chester Vogt. She read the letter twice, then set it down on the work table and didn't move for several minutes. A March purchase. Petch had described the bank's approach to him as occurring in the summer of 1876. The lock had been bought before the transaction was concluded, which meant the intent had preceded the act. Chester Vogt had prepared the place before he had arranged to acquire the right to it. The letter from Harold Birch arrived 11 days after she had written to him. He was not, he wrote, a man who forgot instruments he had witnessed. He described the cellar with a specificity that matched everything Marsh had told her and everything she had measured herself. He confirmed the easement clause had been in the deed when he signed it, because Petch had been particular about it and had read that clause aloud to him before setting his mark. He wrote that he had waited 12 years and that no one had ever come to ask him, and that he had thought sometimes about that deed and about what might have happened to make it worth not asking. He said he would travel to Laramie. Vera had in her possession now the original 1875 deed with the easement clause intact. She had Arlo Petch's letter, written in his own hand, describing the 1876 transaction and naming his counterparty by initials. She had the signed receipt for $22 bearing Chester Vogt's initials on bank stationery. She had the Birmingham Foundry's sales record showing the Brahma lock sold to Chester Vogt in Laramie in March of 1876. She had Harold Birch's written attestation that the easement clause had existed in the deed as signed. She had the key to the cellar, found where Petch had left it. She had the cellar. What she did not have was the suppressed transfer instrument. She would never have it. She suspected it had been destroyed some years ago, and it was not necessary. What she had was sufficient. She sat in Polly Soon's shed for another hour and made a precise list of every document in her possession, with the date of each, the parties named, and the fact each one established. She wrote in her small, clear hand, without haste, the way Clement had taught her to write field notes, one fact per line, no inference stated as fact, no fact stated as inference. Then she wrapped everything in oilcloth, placed it in the leather satchel with her instruments, and went inside for supper. She did not go to the bank. She went to a land attorney named Horatio Falk, whose office was 3 doors down from the recorder's building and who had the reputation in Laramie of being a man who would not take a case he did not believe in. She had heard this about him from Polly Sund, who knew the commercial men of Laramie the way boarding house keepers know the men of their towns, by who paid on time, who argued about small things, and who carried themselves as if the world owed them a favorable accounting. Polly had said Falk was not popular with the bank, which was recommendation enough. His office was a single room with 2 windows and bookshelves covering 3 walls. He was a compact man in his 40s with a habit of reading documents with his whole body slightly forward and his lips almost moving, as if he were walking the words rather than reading them. She spread her documents on his table one by one, in the order she had arranged them, explained each briefly, and then stopped and waited. He read everything twice. The second reading took longer than the first. He was quiet for a while after he set down the Petch letter. He said at last that what she had was more than sufficient to compel the bank to produce its own records in a proceeding before the Territorial Land Court. She said she was not interested in the cellar itself. He looked at her then with the expression of a man recalibrating an expectation. She said the cellar had been Petch's. Petch had sold it. The conveyance was real even if the recording was suppressed, and the bank had paid for it and had legal title to it through the 1876 transaction. What she wanted established was that the bank had then concealed its ownership from Clement when he purchased the surface parcel in 1875, which meant the bank had sold her uncle a property with an undisclosed encumbrance. The cellar and the surface parcel had been in separate hands when Clement bought the surface, and the bank had known it and had not said so. What she wanted was the return of the difference between what Clement had paid in good faith and what he would have paid had the encumbrance been disclosed. She had calculated this as $130, based on what comparable parcels with disclosed easements had sold for in the Elkhorn Creek corridor in that period. She had the comparables in her notebook, which she set on the table. She also wanted the county ledger corrected, not for herself, for the record, and for the right of anyone who came later and pulled the 1875 deed to read it and find it whole. Falk looked at the comparables and then at the notebook. He said $130 was a conservative figure. She said she was not interested in what was generous. She was interested in what was correct. He agreed to take the case for a fee of $30 payable upon resolution, which she accepted. It left her $3. The filing was made in November of 1887. Chester Vogt's attorney attempted twice to delay the proceedings, and once to challenge the admissibility of Petch's letter on the grounds that it was an unsigned codicil to no established instrument. The challenge to the letter was technically competent, and Vera watched from the gallery as Falk disposed of it by presenting in sequence the bank receipt from the tin box and Birch's written statement, each of which independently corroborated the substance of what Petch had written. The letter needed no legal standing of its own. It was sufficient that it described a transaction which 2 other pieces of evidence confirmed had occurred. Harold Birch arrived from Cheyenne on the 3rd day of November, a cold morning with ground frost still on the courthouse steps. He was a tall man, somewhat reduced by age, who walked with a cane and wore his coat buttoned to the collar. He sat in the witness chair and spoke for 40 minutes in a clear, unhurried voice. He identified his signature on the 1875 deed without hesitation. He described Arlo Petch in terms that matched what Vera had gathered from 4 months of inquiry about the man. He described the easement clause, named the parcel, and recalled that Petch had walked him into the cellar itself before the signing to show him what he was retaining. Vogt's attorney challenged him on the distance of time and on his memory. Birch looked at the attorney for a moment before answering, the way a man looks at something that is smaller than it believes itself to be. He said that he had witnessed a great many instruments in his years as a justice of the peace, and that he remembered the ones worth remembering. He was not asked to elaborate. The foundry record and the bank receipt were admitted without serious challenge. Chester Vogt's attorney entered into evidence the bank's own copy of the 1876 easement purchase, which had in fact been preserved, contrary to what Vera had supposed. It showed the full transaction, the payment, the parties, and the agreement. The date of execution was the 12th of August, 1876. The document had never been filed with the county recorder. There was a pause in the proceedings when this document was read into the record. The judge was a deliberate man who did not show much on his face. He read the document once, set it down, and asked Vogt's attorney whether there was an explanation for why a signed and witnessed property transfer had not been recorded in the county ledger. The attorney said the oversight was unintentional. The judge made a note. The bank's own document proved its concealment in the precise administrative language the court required. The Territorial Land Court ruled in December of 1887. The bank was ordered to pay the estate of Clement Crane $130, representing the undisclosed encumbrance on the 1875 sale. The county recorder was directed to enter the easement clause in the permanent ledger under the original 1875 deed date, with a notation that the entry had been omitted in error. No one stated what kind of error. Chester Vogt remained vice president of the Platte County Bank for another 2 years, during which time he was, by all accounts, careful to the point of exhaustion about what went into the county ledger. He did not send any further letters to widows or nieces about lapsed claims. He retired in 1889 to a house in Denver and was not much spoken of afterward. Dolph Marsh retained the surface parcel, the house, and the use of the cellar, which was now documented as having passed from Petch's estate to the bank by way of the 1876 conveyance and from the bank to Marsh by way of the 1879 sale. His title was clean. He shook Vera's hand on the courthouse steps in December and said he was glad it had come out right. She said she was glad as well. The $130 went to settle the final debts against Clement's Missouri estate. There was nothing left over. She sent the payment to the estate's administrator in a bank draft, with a brief covering letter that explained the source. She did not elaborate. He wrote back to acknowledge receipt and said nothing about how it had been obtained, which suited her. She spent the winter in Laramie. The town was cold, and the work was slow between December and March, but there was occasional drafting and record work to be had, and Polly soon charged nothing for the shed, which was where Vera spent most of her working evenings. She obtained her surveying license from the Territorial Office in Cheyenne in February of 1888, filing the application herself, with her own fieldwork record as the supporting documentation. The examiner asked her 3 technical questions about meridian adjustment, and she answered all 3 correctly. He said she was the 5th licensed surveyor in the county. She thanked him and did not correct him. She had understood from the recorder's ledger that there were 3 others. She worked Platte County and the 2 adjoining it for the better part of a decade, laying boundary lines and recording parcels with the precision and patience she had inherited from Clement. She testified before the land court on questions of survey accuracy 4 times in those years. On each occasion, she brought her field notes, her traverse record, and her closing calculations, and she laid them on the table in order, and she let the measurements speak. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She became known, in that county and its neighbors, as the surveyor you hired when there was a question about a line that had been disputed for a long time, and that you needed answered rather than merely continued. She charged standard rates. She turned down work she did not believe was honest. Polly soon still rented her the back room by the year, and Vera still worked some evenings in the small shed behind it, at the same work table where she had read Petch's letter for the first time by candlelight. The shed had a north-facing window that let in good winter light. She had hung her surveying instruments on pegs above the table, the transit and the rod and the chain and the level, each in its proper place. The Brahma key hung there too on a small iron hook near the door. She had not returned it. It was not, strictly speaking, hers to keep. It had belonged to Petch, and then by circumstance to the bank, and the court had not adjudicated it either way. She kept it because it was evidence, and because a woman in her line of work does not leave evidence lying on the ground. She took it down sometimes in the evenings and held it in her palm, a hollow cylinder of brass, palm width, its internal geometry precise and invisible from the outside. It did not look like much. Nothing that had done that much work ever does. Clement had told her, the last summer she spent with him in Missouri, that the most important thing a surveyor carries is not the transit or the rod, but the understanding that the land does not lie. Fences move. Deeds get lost. Ledgers get altered by men who believe they will never be asked to account for it. The land itself does not move. You can always re-establish the line if you are willing to go back to the original monument and start from there. The original monument, in this case, had been cut from limestone by an old man's hands over 2 summers, sealed with mortar and left in the dark. It had held. If there is a parcel of ground in Platte County, Wyoming, that holds a piece of paper in the wall and an old key on a hook, and a woman who knows what they cost to find, then something was set right in the autumn and winter of 1887 that had been crooked for a long time before. The line was reestablished. It was enough. If this kind of story stays with you, the way a deed found at the bottom of a cold, dark niche stays with you, leave a word below. There are more of them, women and documents and things that were buried before they could be read. Here is another one waiting.